Three, two, one, and here we go. Welcome to Inside Israel, everyone. I'm Joel Chasnoff, coming to you from Ra'anana, outside of Tel Aviv. This is episode 73 of Inside Israel, called IDF Fails. This past week, the Israel Defense Forces, the Israeli army, released its official report, not only on how the October 7th massacre happened, but perhaps more important, how it was allowed to continue to happen for 14 plus hours with very little resistance from the IDF. And in today's broadcast, what I want to do is share some key insights from this report. And just as importantly, let you know how Israelis are reacting to it and what we feel about this failure of the IDF. Before we jump in, I do want to answer two questions. We're going to start with the questions today. This one is hot off the press. I got it less than an hour ago from Gary in Maryland. So thank you for writing so speedily, Gary. He writes, I just read that Israel is cutting off electricity to Gaza. What do Israelis make of this? Well, given that this is a very fresh story, I don't know that Israelis are really chatting about it quite yet. But I will tell you this, Gary. I think it's part of a larger question that we Israelis are dealing with. And I'm sure a lot of you, wherever you are thinking about as well, which is how much aid, how much assistance should we be giving to the Gazans anyway? You know, there are many here in Israel that felt that Israel's first response after October 7th should have been to cut off all aid into Gaza, meaning all supplies into Gaza, cut off water, cut off electricity, cut off gas, cut off food. And you can call that laying siege. I don't care what you call it, but they took our civilians. They took more than 200 of our Israeli citizens. And so Israelis were pounding our heads against the wall, wondering, why are we helping them? Why are we sending gas into Gaza? Because we know why that gas is needed. It's needed because Hamas's tunnels underneath Gaza are so deep that the only way to keep oxygen flowing in those tunnels is to use generators that pump oxygen down there. And these generators run on fuel. And Israel was allowing fuel into Gaza. We were allowing food, water, electricity. All of this was allowing Hamas to continue their war against Israel and really keep Hamas going when we had all the tools to cut them off. Now, the one problem, of course, is the hostages. The minute we cut off food, electricity, water to Gaza, we're also cutting it off to our hostages. But overall, there has been this big question in Israel of why are we helping them? Why are we allowing electricity and food to go in? You can say, well, it's not humanitarian to make all of the Gazan population suffer. Well, it's not humanitarian to snatch 200 plus Israelis from their homes, including children with autism, senior citizens, women, and to hold them captive in Gaza. And all we had to say is, we're cutting off these supplies until you release our civilians. And so many Israelis were wondering why that was not done. So for me, the only dilemma, Gary, the only problem with Israel cutting off electricity into Gaza is that our hostages are there and that they will suffer for it as well. But in terms of the larger humanitarian question, the fact that 2 million Gazan civilians are suffering because we cut off electricity, that does not bother me. And let me tell you, it does not bother most Israelis. There was a very moving interview from Liri Albag. I hope I'm saying her name right. One of the hostages who was released over the past month. And she talked about, first of all, she comes across as a wonderful, intelligent, really brilliant young woman who would often negotiate with Hamas on behalf of other hostages. And she said that she has lost all faith in the Gazan people and really doesn't believe that there are innocent bystanders in Gaza. She said that she remembers when she was being held in Gaza and transported from one place to another. Children were cheering and jeering her. Women, families, were were jeering the Israeli hostages who were there. And in general, we know that when Israelis were taken into Gaza, they were kicked, they were beaten by children, by civilians. So this idea of the good Gazans, the ordinary Gazans who just want good lives, a lot of Israelis, including myself, have lost faith in this idea. So I personally do not have a problem with cutting off the electricity or necessarily starving the Gazan people to death, except for the fact that it harms our own hostages. And we do know that the harsher we are to Palestinian prisoners in jails in Israel, and the harsher we are to the Gazan people, the worse the hostages, the Israelis, are treated in Gaza. So that's the dilemma. But in terms of the humanitarian angle, I certainly don't have an issue with it. And I would imagine that a lot of Israelis do not. Our second question comes from Art in Florida. Art writes, Joel, ever since you spoke at the Chabad of Naples, I've been listening to you every week. Love your podcast. Thank you, Art. Only problem I see is that your deep hatred of Bibi has affected your judgment. To wit, your belief that Bibi doesn't want the hostages back. Yes, Bibi has to answer for October 7th, but you seem to lose it when it comes to him. Just my opinion, and I could be wrong. All the best, Art. Well, I have a rule in my house with my kids, my wife, that we do not use the word hate. But I'm going to use the word hate. I do hate Bibi. And Art, I'm going to disagree with you here. I believe that Bibi does not want the hostages back. You know, before I became a stand-up comedian, I was an actor, or I guess concurrently to becoming a comedian, I was an actor in New York, and I'm still an actor here, and I was trained on what's called the Meisner technique, the neighborhood playhouse in New York. And one of the, probably the principle of Meisner technique is behavior doesn't lie. And I think it's true for life as well. The people in our lives, whether it's your spouse, your work colleagues, whomever, they can say whatever they want, but behavior ultimately will tell you what they want and what they believe. Behavior doesn't lie. It's a principle of being a good actor that you don't base your performance on manufactured emotion, but you base it on behavior. And I believe it's true right here when it comes to Bibi Netanyahu. If he wanted the hostages out, they would be out. And here's why I say this. Israel negotiated a deal with Hamas, and it's terrible. It's a terrible deal, but it's the best deal we could possibly get. And the deal called for stage one, the release of the certain number of hostages who've all been released. And now we're supposed to be in stage two, where we release the rest of the hostages. But Israel is currently not negotiating stage two. And the only reason we can come up with is that Bibi does not want there to be a stage two, because I tell you, the minute the hostages are out, Bibi is finished. He's going to be on trial. His government could collapse. He needs this war. And frankly, he needs these hostages just about as much as Hamas does. Bibi is finished once the hostages are out. And I know, Art, you might think that I'm an outlier here, but let me tell you this. A new poll just came out. 72% of Israelis, that's 72%, believe that Bibi needs to resign. Now, that leaves 28% who don't, and those are his hard-line ultra supporters who will never leave him. So you're basically talking about anyone whose opinion could be swayed now believes that our prime minister is responsible for October 7th and needs to accept responsibility and needs to step down. And the majority of Israelis in this poll do feel that it's in Bibi's interest to keep the war going and the hostages in Gaza. Now you add on to that all the other stuff we're learning about Bibi, like the hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of dollars that Netanyahu's government has been receiving from Qatar. Qatar is where Hamas leaders are housed. And it turns out that Netanyahu's government has been in touch with Qatar, been receiving money from Qatar as a bribe to plant pro-Qatari stories in the Israeli media. This is filthy. And on top of that, there's all the other shenanigans and crime and scandals that the Netanyahu family have been involved in. You can read about all this online. Spend some time researching it. But in terms of my feeling, I don't think I've lost it. I think those who still support Bibi have lost it. And if there were an election held now with Naftali Bennett running, Bibi would lose. So for me and a lot of people, it's not a matter of who, it's a matter of when will the new government take over. But for the time being, I'm convinced that if Bibi wanted the hostages out, behavior would not lie. He would have them home. All right. Now we're going to move on to today's main topic, the IDF report on October 7th. So this is a long and detailed report, and you can read portions and overviews online. I want to break it down for you and try to make it as simple as possible. Basically, there were 6 big findings from this report, and I'm going to touch on each one very briefly. So mistake number 1 was a complete underestimation of Hamas. The belief was that Hamas only wanted to stay in power in Gaza. There was no belief that they actually wanted to attack Israel, because the thought was that if they attacked Israel, they would be defeated by Israel and then they would be out of power. So this is really just a matter of the echo chamber. The echo chamber. Too many yes men. Too many people agreeing the same thing, literally trapped in the own box of their beliefs and not being able to look at the intelligence and say, maybe Hamas actually wants to attack us. No matter what intelligence they saw, the IDF continued to believe that all Hamas wanted was to stay in power. So that was mistake number 1, underestimating Hamas and misreading their actual goals. Number 2, intelligence failures. According to the report, there were 5, in Hebrew we use the word bolet, 5 obvious warning signs between the night of October 6th and the morning of October 7th that pointed to the imminence of an attack by Hamas. Now, only one of these was made public. In the report, the other 4 are classified. The one that was made public is the activation of Israeli SIM cards in Hamas mobile telephones. The idea being that once they activate these Israeli SIM cards, they could use their phones in Israel to communicate with each other. So IDF intelligence saw thousands of Hamas Israeli SIM cards being activated in Gaza, but still thought that there was no attack needed because of mistake number 1, their conviction that all Hamas wanted to do was to stay in power. Some of the other intelligence signs I can point to, we've covered before on this podcast. Now, like I said, the other 4 were confidential, but here are some of the things I'm sure were mentioned. Number 1, the report Jericho Walls. There was a document called Jericho Walls that was discovered by a female member of the 8200 Elite Intelligence Unit. She shared it, and her superiors, who were male, dismissed her as delusional, as out of hand for thinking that this would actually come to fruition. And Jericho Walls basically laid out Hamas's entire plan for October 7th. We have the warnings of the Tatzpitaniot. I mentioned Liri Albag before. She was one of these Tatzpitaniot, the young women who sit on the border, watching television screens, watching the cameras, watching what Hamas is doing. They reported over and over for months that they were seeing unusual Hamas activity, including on the night of October 6th, and they were ignored. Again, they were told that they were out of their minds, delusional, it was nothing to worry about. And there was the movement of Hamas forces. We saw them drilling, we saw them preparing mock Israeli villages. I think they had a mock Israeli tank. All of it was ignored. These were not perceived as urgent threats. So a huge intelligence failure here. I've said before, the question is not how did it get past us? It's How did we ignore all of the intelligence we had? Mistake number 3, over-reliance on defensive measures. There was this belief that our drones, our cameras along the border, our fence, our barbed wire fence, that these were adequate to keep Hamas out. Now, many, many times, Hamas would approach the border and we would simply let them be near the border. Right now, the new situation is that there's probably going to be a buffer zone between Israel and Gaza, this sort of no man's land that Israel has control of, that if anyone steps into that buffer zone, they would be dealt with. But our defensive measures proved useless on October 7th. By the way, I am not a conspiracy theory guy, but this is one of the reasons that there are a significant number of people in Israel who believe that there is a conspiracy happening here. I know soldiers in the army who've served on these bases in the South, and they say that if a bird drops a single feather on one of these barbed wire fences, alarms go off and the IDF is called into action. So the fact that on October 7th, Hamas was able to get so close and nothing was activated, no IDF forces were amassed to fight back. For that reason, there are many people in Israel, I'd say at least 5 to 10%, who believe that there's some sort of conspiracy theory going on. I'm not going to get into that, but you can see why they would believe this. Number 4, another big mistake, the delayed military response from the IDF. It was very poor. It was slow to organize. There was no such battle plan for this kind of a situation where 3,000 Hamas terrorists had infiltrated the country. There was no plan for what to do. So what happened is soldiers really just started showing up on their own. I told you before about my good friend Omer, who was an elite tennis player but chose to serve instead in an elite army unit instead of pursuing his tennis career. And on the morning of October 7th, he just put on his uniform and drove to his base in the south, got a gun, and was waiting for orders of what to do. And there were no orders because no one knew what to do. So the soldiers like him just started going on their own and fighting without really a battle plan. Now, here's what else happened. As soldiers began to get orders, they would move south. They would fight a battle, but instead of going, as they kept going south and south in Israel, they would confront new Hamas terrorists and have new battles with them. And this explains why they never got to the southernmost communities in Israel, because they kept getting entrapped in other battles along the way. So the south of Israel, when we hear that they were left exposed, vulnerable for 14 plus hours, that's why. It's because our IDF soldiers, no one was sent to the very south of these communities immediately. They kept working their way down, but getting stopped along the way. Number 5, underfunding of the South. There were not enough military resources dedicated toward protecting military bases in the South and protecting the moshavim and kibbutzim down there. For years, these southern communities along the Gaza border were asking for more money so they could buy their own guns, their own equipment, for their kitat konanut, for their readiness squads, but they were denied the funding from the government. So that was another big, as we say, fashla, another big mistake. And number 6, a big finding of this report was that the Nahal Oz military base, which was supposed to be really the base that would hold against any infiltration from Gaza, it was easily overtaken by Hamas. And the report explains that it was, again, vastly underfunded, that only 40 to 50 Hamas terrorists were able to thoroughly overtake the base. The soldiers were unprepared. It was Shabbat and Simchat Torah morning, so they were just sort of relaxed and not expecting anything to happen. Many of the soldiers were women who were unarmed. And the soldiers, when the base was overrun, many of the elite command, they fortified themselves in what's called the war room, the Chadal Milchama, Hamal, attempting to coordinate some sort of a defense and to call for help, but this war room was overtaken by Hamas, and so the officers and commanders were killed. Now, worst of all is that the chief of staff has admitted this week that he knew that Nahal Oz was vulnerable and exposed. Nahal Oz, this main military base, which was supposed to be the first line of defense against Hamas, is less than a kilometer from Gaza. It's about 850 meters, half a mile. And the former chief of staff, he's since stepped down. We now have Ayal Zamir as the new chief of staff. But the former chief of staff said that he was aware that this base was vulnerable and exposed, and he tried to get funding for it. But again, the IDF refused to provide the 200 million shekels it would take to properly fortify this base and prepare it for an attack against Hamas. So again, those are the 6 failures. The underestimation of Hamas and their goals, the intelligence signs the night of October 6th and 7th that were ignored, over-reliance on defensive measures, the delayed military response, the underfunding of the South, and the poor condition of the Nahal Oz military base. Now, a real important angle here is, what are Israelis saying about this? And what I want to offer you now is sort of a quick perspective on how Israelis see the army and why this is so painful to us. The army is the most trusted institution in Israel, more than the school system, more than the medical system, transportation, and by far more than the government. We call the IDF Tzva Ha'am, a military of the people. And it really is a military of the people. Almost all Jewish Israelis serve in the IDF. Our children serve. We look forward to them serving. It's a point of pride. That day we drive them to the Bakum, the Basis Klita Umiyun, the induction center. So this report, it's very personal for us. It is our most trusted institution letting us down. And I won't lie to you, there is a little bit of a loss of faith in the army as we move forward. We know it's a big bureaucracy. So as much as we read this report and shudder at its findings, we also are asking ourselves, how likely is it that changes will actually happen? And I'll tell you my own point of view as a former soldier here and as a father of 2 kids who just got out of the army and one will be going in soon. You know, one of the big takeaways for me as a lone soldier in a combat unit of the IDF is just how much it is an army of kids. And I don't say that in an insulting way. But the truth is, the commanders are 19 years old. The officers are 20 and 21 years old. They're extremely mature. And if you were to line up the average Israeli teenager against the average American teenager, the Israeli teenager would be eons more mature than their American counterparts, because Israelis grow up knowing they'll serve in the army, and this country matures you quickly. But at the same time, we can't forget that the army is an enormous, enormous institution with a lot of moving parts. And many of the leadership roles are 20 and 21-year-olds. And it's very disorganized at times. I was shocked when I was a soldier at just how disorganized the army was, whether it was basic training or even serving in Lebanon against Hezbollah. It's balagan. It's chaos, as any big organization would be. And I'm telling you, I am sure it is no different in the US military or any other armed forces in the world. That's just what happens when you take thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, often 18, 19, 20 years old, and try to coordinate their actions. Now, one final angle I want to touch on here is the money angle. You know, I told you before that Herzi Halevi, the former chief of staff, said that He asked for 200 million shekels, which is what, $60 million? In the scheme of a budget, it's not that much. 200 million shekels to fortify Nahal Oz base in the south, and he was denied that request. Now, at the same time, the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox here in Israel, continue to not serve in the IDF. Another report came out this past week that of the 10,000 draft orders sent to the ultra-Orthodox over the past 3 months, a total of 177. That's right. 177 out of 10,000 potential soldiers actually drafted into the IDF. Meanwhile, the ultra-Orthodox Haredim community is now threatening to collapse the government if they do not receive 1 billion shekels. 1 billion. 5 times what's needed to fortify the Nahal Oz military base. They want 5 times that to continue their subsidized daycare programs and yeshiva studies and unemployment subsidies while they continue to not serve in the IDF. So that's an angle of this report that I really want you to, as we say in Hebrew, lisfog, to absorb. Just how, not just unfair, but criminally unfair it is that the ultra-Orthodox continue to not serve, but to receive these huge sums of money, simply because the government ruling coalition needs them in order to stay in power. For me, this is the big crisis facing Israel, perhaps more than Iran in the long term, or Islamic Jihad, or Hamas in the long term. The real long-term question is, what kind of society is this going to be when we have 13% of the population who is feeding off, literally, like parasites, feeding off the other 87%? That wraps it up for this week's episode of Inside Israel. As always, you can email me at joel@joelchasnoff.com for more information about this podcast or about my comedy, my books, and other content. Check out joelchasnoff.com/podcast. And on my website, you can also see a link to my first book, The 188th Crybaby Brigade. I highly recommend that book to show you insights into what it's actually like in the Israeli army. And I'm not telling you this because I want to make a sale. The royalties on books is actually quite small. I would see shekels. So it's not the sale I'm looking for. But it's genuinely to show you what the IDF is like from an inside point of view. You can see that on my website as well. Next week's broadcast is going to be Sunday, March 16th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. The topic, I haven't determined it quite yet, but I will let you know in the newsletter that comes out on Thursday. And again, you can get that newsletter by signing up at the bottom, the footer of joelchasnoff.com. Thank you so much for joining everyone today. I hope you found this enlightening, insightful. Please continue to send your questions. And I'm Joel Chasnoff signing off from Ra'anana. Lehitraot.